Before the map of the world was etched with the borders we know today, there was a silent, sprawling landmass, a continent pulsating with life, complex empires, and thousands of years of untamed history. Imagine standing on a beach in the Bahamas on a humid October morning in 1492, watching the horizon, unaware that the three strange wooden towers floating toward you are about to dismantle the world you have known since the dawn of time. This is not the sanitized story of a discovery found in textbooks. This is the visceral, untold reality of a collision that shattered two worlds and birthed the modern American story in a single chaotic breath. In 1492, the land we now call the United States was far from an empty wilderness. It was a thriving, vibrant mosaic of civilizations. In the arid Southwest, the Ancestral Puebloans had already carved cities into the sheer faces of sandstone cliffs, managing water with an engineering genius that rivals modern irrigation. In the lush Mississippi Valley, the Mississippian culture had built Cahokia, a city with a population density that matched European hubs of the time, centered around massive earthen mounds that scraped the sky. They were astronomers, farmers, diplomats, and philosophers who navigated an intricate web of trade routes spanning from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico. There was no United States, but there were thousands of sovereign nations, each with its own language, legal system, and spiritual connection to the land.
On the other side of the Atlantic, the Iberian Peninsula was a pressure cooker of ambition. King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella had just achieved the Reconquista, ending centuries of religious conflict by reclaiming Granada. Spain was newly unified, flush with a militant, triumphant energy, and desperate for economic supremacy. They needed gold to fund their wars and glory to bolster their prestige, but the Ottoman Empire held an iron grip on the land routes to the East Indies. The spice trade, the lifeblood of European wealth, was bottlenecked. Enter Christopher Columbus, a man driven by an obsession that bordered on madness. He didn't just want to find a new route. He was convinced he was chosen by destiny to sail westward into the abyss to reach the markets of Asia. He was wrong about the size of the earth, wrong about the distance, and unaware that a massive, unintended obstacle lay in his path. When the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria finally shattered the horizon, the encounter was not merely a meeting of ships. It was a meeting of alien realities. For the Taino people, the indigenous inhabitants of the Caribbean, these were not explorers. They were beings who seemed to have stepped out of a fever dream, dressed in heavy, clanking metal, carrying strange weapons, and possessing an obsession with a yellow metal they called gold. The initial exchange was one of curiosity and cautious diplomacy. The Taino were skilled mariners who greeted the newcomers with hospitality, providing food and navigation tips. They had no way of knowing that the arrival of these men was the first tremor of an earthquake that would levy their society.
The discovery was, in truth, an invasion of concepts. Columbus brought with him the encomienda system, a brutal framework of forced labor that would eventually become the foundation of colonial extraction. He did not come to trade as equals. He came as a representative of a crown that viewed the land as empty, the people as savages, and the natural resources as commodities for plunder. The tragic irony is that 1492 was the year the Columbian Exchange was ignited, a biological and cultural exchange that would forever alter the human diet and the global environment, but at a horrific human cost. The most catastrophic arrival wasn't the gunpowder or the steel swords, it was the unseen passenger, microbes. Because the populations of the Americas had been isolated for millennia, they had no immunity to old world diseases like smallpox, measles, and influenza. Within the span of a few generations, these invisible killers would ravage the continent, claiming up to 90% of the indigenous population in some areas. It was a demographic apocalypse that left once thriving cities silent and allowed European settlers to move into what they mistakenly perceived as untapped land.
As 1492 transitioned into 1493, the ripple effects were felt globally. The influx of American precious metals, silver and gold stolen from the hearts of civilizations like the Aztecs and Incas, flooded European markets. This sudden, massive injection of wealth triggered a period of hyperinflation in Spain, but it also provided the capital that fueled the European Renaissance and, eventually, the Industrial Revolution. America, the land Columbus thought was the outskirts of Asia, became the engine room of a new global economy built on the back of stolen land and forced labor.
The year 1492 serves as a mirror. When we look at it, we see the audacity of human exploration, but we also see the brutality of human ambition. It was the birth of the New World, but that birth was marked by the violent death of the old. It created the United States as a byproduct of a global quest for power, setting the stage for centuries of conflict over land, liberty, and human rights. The story of 1492 is not a conclusion. It is the prologue to everything that has happened since. It forces us to ask, what happens when two worlds collide? Who gets to write the history, and who gets to live it? The ships that docked in the Bahamas in 1492 didn't just carry sailors. They carried the seeds of the modern age, the good, the bad, and the irrevocably complex. It remains the most important year in the story of the Americas because it marks the moment the world became small, connected, and forever changed. The silence of the pre-1492 continent was replaced by the noise of an arriving civilization. And from that dissonance, the United States eventually emerged, bearing the scars and the possibilities of that first fateful encounter.
The ripple effects of 1492 did not stop at the Caribbean shoreline. They surged across the Atlantic and back again, creating a feedback loop that permanently recalibrated human civilization. As the 15th century bled into the 16th, the New World ceased to be a vague rumor whispered in the courts of Europe and became a tangible, aggressive reality. The year 1492 had uncorked a bottle of ambition that no king, pope, or emperor could ever hope to seal again. The immediate reaction in Europe was a frenzied land grab. The news of Columbus's voyage, fueled by exaggerated tales of limitless gold and exotic riches, transformed the Atlantic from a terrifying, impassable barrier into a superhighway for empire. The Treaty of Tordesillas, signed just 2 years later, was perhaps the most audacious document in history. The Pope essentially drew a line down the map, gifting the non-Christian world to Spain and Portugal. It was a cartographic declaration of war on the autonomy of indigenous peoples, who had been the stewards of this hemisphere for millennia.
While the Spanish focus initially remained in the Caribbean and Central America, the echoes of their arrival reached the far corners of the North American continent. The horses that escaped, the tools that were traded, and the diseases that traveled via indigenous trade networks moved faster than any European soldier. By the time the first English, French, and Dutch settlers arrived decades later, they weren't walking into a pristine wilderness. They were walking into a landscape already in the midst of a silent, biological, and social transformation. The American landscape was being reshaped by the consequences of the 1492 encounter long before the first permanent English settlements were even envisioned. Consider the shift in the global diet. Before 1492, the potato did not exist in Europe, nor did tomatoes in Italy, cacao in the Swiss Alps, or chili peppers in Asia. These were all products of the American land, developed through generations of indigenous horticultural genius. The introduction of these crops to the Old World caused a population explosion in Europe and Asia that provided the labor force for the Industrial Age. Conversely, the introduction of wheat, sugarcane, and coffee to the Americas transformed the ecology of the continent, leading to the massive deforestation and plantation systems that would eventually define the American South and the Caribbean. This was an ecological revolution that fundamentally changed how humanity interacted with the Earth.
But there was a darker, more complex layer to this new world. The collapse of the indigenous population left a massive void in labor. European colonizers, driven by the insatiable demand for sugar, silver, and gold, turned to the brutal exploitation of human beings. This led to the tragic integration of the transatlantic slave trade into the colonial economic model. The year 1492 is the ancestor of the modern plantation economy, linking the fate of the Americas to the displacement of millions of Africans. It is a historical chain reaction. Columbus's desire for a shorter route to Asian gold led to the exploitation of the Taino, which led to the demographic collapse, which led to the reliance on enslaved labor, which laid the foundation for the racial and economic structures that would shape the American experience for the next 5 centuries. In the United States today, we are still grappling with the legacies of this collision. Our laws, our cities, our agricultural systems, and our national identity are all footnotes to that initial encounter. The American dream, a concept of unlimited opportunity and the ability to reinvent oneself, finds its genesis in the idea of the New World that 1492 popularized. It was the moment that the world became a singular market, a singular interconnected web of cultures, and a singular theater of human conflict.
When we look back at the 1492 story, we are not looking at a dusty artifact of the past. We are looking at the foundational myth of our modern existence. It was a moment of profound, irreversible transition. The continent was no longer a hidden jewel, but a battleground for global powers, a laboratory for new forms of governance, and a crucible for the modern human identity. Every time we cross a border, trade a currency, or consume a product, we are participating in the global system that Columbus stumbled into while looking for spices. 1492 was not just the end of the Middle Ages, it was the birth of the world we currently inhabit, a world that is both brilliantly innovative and haunted by the ghosts of its violent inception. The story of the Americas is a story of continuous rediscovery, continuous struggle, and continuous evolution. The encounter that began with 3 small ships has expanded into a complex tapestry of cultures, religions, and ideologies that define the very fabric of the United States. We are the inheritors of 1492, living in the long shadow of those first footsteps on the sands of San Salvador. As we navigate the complexities of the 21st century, the lessons of that fateful year remain more relevant than ever. The power of curiosity, the danger of unchecked ambition, and the enduring reality that we are all, ultimately, part of the same global story, forever tethered to the choices made on a beach over 500 years ago. The long shadow. Why 1492 defined the modern American soul. If we step back and analyze 1492 as the Big Bang of the modern era, we begin to see that it wasn't just a physical collision of 2 continents, it was a psychological one. For the European mind, the existence of a new world shattered the medieval worldview. Suddenly, the Earth was larger than the Bible or the ancient Greeks had predicted. This realization forced a desperate, frantic scramble to categorize, map, and claim. This intellectual panic is the true origin of the American drive toward manifest destiny, expansionism, and the relentless pursuit of more. The United States, as we know it today, is a country born from this spirit of radical reinvention.
The people who eventually settled the 13 colonies and later pushed across the Mississippi were driven by the same restless energy that sent Columbus westward. They were migrants, outcasts, and speculators, all searching for a second chance or a city upon a hill. This is why the legacy of 1492 is woven into the very fabric of the American identity. We are a nation that prides itself on being new, on breaking from the past, and on constantly expanding our frontiers, whether they are geographical, technological, or scientific.
However, this constant forward motion has always come at a price. The story of 1492 teaches us that progress is rarely a linear path of improvement. It is a complex, often jagged arc. The European technological leap, printing presses, navigation tools, and military innovations allowed them to dominate, but it also masked a profound moral failure. By treating the Americas as a blank slate or an uninhabited wilderness, Europeans ignored the sophisticated, human-managed civilizations that had been thriving there for centuries. This erasure of history is a wound that the United States is still healing from today. When we talk about the American experience, we must include the perspective of the indigenous nations who faced the apocalypse of 1492. Their history is not a sidebar, it is the center of the story. The loss of their lands, their cultures, and their lives was the bedrock upon which the colonial wealth of the Americas was built. The silver mined by the Spanish in the Andes and the tobacco farmed by the English in Virginia were the first steps in a global economy that would eventually lead to the digital, hyper-connected world we inhabit today. As we look at the world in 2026, we see that the globalization initiated by 1492 has reached its final form. Every currency in our pockets, every language spoken across the Americas, and even our modern concepts of national borders are echoes of those three small ships. We live in a world that Columbus helped create, yet a world that has arguably outgrown his narrow vision. We no longer see the world as something to be conquered, but as something to be understood and sustained.
The story of 1492, then, is a cautionary tale and an inspiration. It reminds us that our actions, even those taken with incomplete information or misguided intentions, can have consequences that ripple out for centuries. It asks us to consider what kind of legacy we are creating today. As we continue to explore new frontiers, whether in the deep oceans or the vast expanse of space, we must carry with us the lesson of that fateful year, that true discovery is not about claiming, but about connecting.